Hi, I'm Steve Palumbi from Stanford University, and this is where I work at the Hopkins Marine Station. I mean, you can see it's a stunningly beautiful place. The shoreline vibrant with life, and the bay as well. Whales, seals, sea lions, white sharks, seabirds. It's an incredibly beautiful spot. But it wasn't always this way. And this talk is about the things that changed in Monterey Bay to make it not so good, and then in particular the people that worked so hard to bring it to life the way we see it right now. Where we're going to start with that is actually in Santa Barbara, 1969, an oil spill. At the time, the biggest oil spill in the United States that washed north and hit the Santa Barbara shoreline, oiling birds and oiling the shoreline and causing an immediate reaction in the local community and actually all along the state to this environmental disaster. Because all of a sudden, it seemed like the ocean itself, the big, vibrant, beautiful, lovely ocean, was actually in danger. And two of the people in Monterey who were particularly affected by that were Julie Packard and her sister Nancy Burnett, who were working as marine biologists in the area, knew the incredible life of the bay, how beautiful it was, how wonderful it was, how precious it was, and how at risk. And so they began working in a way that changed how the business model of Monterey was done. And to see how that actually plays out, we're going to take a little step back in time and revisit the histories of the women who came and really made a huge difference to how the bay was seen, how we worked with it, and now how the economy is in total tune with the environment. We go back to the Western discovery of Monterey Bay. That was in the mid 1700s. Of course, there had been people here, the Olones and the Esselins, who had been living here for thousands of years. Westerners came in the late 1700s, and Jean de la Perouse, in particular, wrote at the time, "There's not a country in the world which more abounds in fish and game of every description." And in fact, Jean de la Perouse, when he sailed in to visit the Spanish settlement in Monterey that was already here, also wrote that there was a problem with the whales. It's impossible to describe either the number of whales, he wrote, or their familiarity with breath that caused the most annoying stench. So that was his biggest problem with Monterey. There were so many whales, it made the air smell. Now, he also wrote back to the King of France that there was a very particular species here that was of enormous commercial value, and that the Spanish would soon begin to exploit it. And that defines the business model that most of the ocean was approached with at the time. That first species that was exploited were sea otters. Their luxurious pelt was very expensive in international markets. And so the way of doing business with the ocean at the time was find something to exploit, figure out how to get it, sell it, make money, repeat until it was gone, and then move on to the next species or the next resource. So otters were exploited till they were virtually extirpated from the West Coast. Whales were as well. Whaling started in 1854. It was over by 1899 because there were just not enough whales to exploit. The same was true of abalone, seabirds, and of course the iconic fishery of Monterey that Cannery Row is known for, and another perfectly good example of this same business model, and that's the sardine fishery. That started in the 1910s and it quickly ramped up through the 1920s into the 1930s as one of the biggest fisheries on the West Coast. And it attracted a lot of attention, and it also attracted a lot of science, in particular from Frances Clark. Frances was one of the very first women fisheries scientists in the world, and she studied in particular the sardine industry along the West Coast of the United States, in Monterey in particular. She ran the California State Fisheries Lab for 17 years, published many papers, and was a world authority on the fishing industry and the way the fishing industry interacted with fish stocks. She also was one of the very first people to ring a bell of caution about the sardine industry. This was the way the industry was progressing. Everyone thought it was virtually inexhaustible, but not Francis. Francis wrote in 1937, "The future of the California sardine fishery remains in doubt. Present indicators are that the demand exceeds the supply." Everybody else was saying, well, no, there's plenty of sardines. It's not a problem. But Francis looked at the effort that went into catching the sardines, and even though the numbers kept going up, the effort kept going up even more. So her argument was that, well, that the fishing effort was getting more and more and more of the available fish, and there was not enough left there to repopulate after that. She basically was in a little bit of a battle with the other fisheries biologists in the state about that. Here's one of the kinds of things that they were trying to deal with. Another fisheries biologist named Marr was saying that the future sardine populations had no relationship to current sardine numbers. That is, the population that you see next year has nothing to do with the population that's there today. And Francis' reply was, well, of course they did, because the sardines today are the parents of the sardines in the next generation, and of course they're related to one another. It turns out that of the two of them, Francis was right, and that the sardine industry basically collapsed right after World War II because there was so much effort put into catching more and more and more sardines during the war that there was not enough of the population left to repopulate after that. There was also a shift in the climate as well, and the double whammy dropped the sardine industry way down into its tracks and then led to its demise. Francis also started a California coastwide effort to understand the oceans. She started something called Cal Coffee that is still going on today, and was one of the real pioneers of bringing science to bear on this really important societal and economic question. Well, the entire industry, the fishing industry here, was following the same model as the otters and the whales and the seals, but there was a big difference. And that's that along with the fishery came an industry, the canning industry. And that changed the whole dynamic because it brought with it, that canning industry, a whole other set of problems. And those problems are encapsulated in this picture, which is about 1932. It's taken on the above the canneries of Cannery Row. And what you can see here coming out of those canneries is sludge. It's the stuff that falls out of the canneries when the canneries are operating, the guts, the tails, the skin, the heads of the sardines. And it created an incredible pollution of the area and an incredible stench, not only from this sludge, but also the reduction ovens that took the sardines and then essentially cooked them into fish meal. Rolf Bolin, who was a professor at Hopkins in the 1940s, wrote that the fumes from the scum floating on the waters of the bay were so bad they turned lead-based paints black. And this became a huge problem for the people living right next to the bay. Not only was the resources of the bay being overexploited, but the industry led to an incredible decline in the quality of life there. Well, in steps our second hero, Julia Platt. Julia was a very special woman because in the late 1800s, she was determined to be a marine biologist. This is a picture of Julia in the late 1890s at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute on the East Coast. She was in a graduate program there. She went on to do a PhD in marine zoology. She couldn't do that in the United States because she was a woman, so she went to Germany to get her PhD. She came back to the United States to take up this career, settled in Pacific Grove where the Hopkins Marine Station was, but she couldn't get a job in academics as a marine zoologist at Stanford because Stanford didn't hire women. Neither did Harvard or Yale or Chicago or any of the major universities, and Julia wouldn't be a professor at a women's college. She settled in Pacific Grove and became a civic leader, changed the way the city worked, and changed its relationship to the ocean because her premise was that the people that lived along the ocean had a right to a good environment that was there, and the canneries were polluting that environment. To show her relationship to the ocean, this is like her most famous exploit in the middle here. Julia was essentially here taking down a fence. At the time, the people that were living in this house on Lover's Point at the beach had put a fence across the beach so people couldn't get through. And of course, that is against state law, it's against city law as well. And so Julia broke the fence so people could get through. But they put the lock back. She broke the lock. They put it back. And this is a picture of her then with a crowbar and a hammer taking down the fence and laying it on the beach so that people could get in. And that was her very direct way of ensuring that people had access to the quality of life and the quality of ocean that she knew they deserved. She also invented tweeting. And so she would put placards up all over about the things that she thought and the things she did. And this placard was particularly great. It says, "Opened by Julia B. Platt." She put this on the fence on the ground. "This entrance to the beach must be left open at all hours when the public might reasonably wish to pass through. I act in the matter because the council and police department of Pacific Grove are men and possibly somewhat timid." That meant that she had a direct impact on how people interacted with the ocean. That kept going as she became a more senior civic leader in town, and she clashed with the pollution coming out of the canneries because there was nothing that she could do about that particular problem. The city council eventually said, "Julia, if you want to run the town, you have to be mayor." And so she ran for mayor. Her campaign slogan was, "It will take a good man to beat me." She convinced the California state legislature to allow Pacific Grove to manage its own shoreline. She won the mayoralty, and then she quickly moved to declare the Pacific Grove Marine Gardens, one of the first times any community along the coast, on the West Coast, almost anywhere in the world, took an active role in setting aside part of the marine environment so that it could be productive and healthy and protected from as many of the insults that she could possibly protect it from. She did this not because it would change the pollution, because it wouldn't. And this is one of the main lessons to me from Julia Platt, because she looked out into the ocean at a very big problem, too big for her to solve, and said, "What can I do? I can't solve that problem. What can I do to help? What other problem can I do that will make a big difference?" And so what she did was protect part of the shoreline. And she wrote in the minutes of the Pacific Grove City Council that she was doing that, setting up these areas, these gardens, these protected zones from where the tiny larvae may swim or be carried by currents to all points along the shore and become attached, grow up, and replace those taken for food or curio. This is exactly the reason why we set up marine protected areas now, for those exact reasons, to protect populations so that they can continue to reproduce and seed other areas of the ocean. Well, Julia became mayor when she was 74 years old. She served one term. She set up the marine gardens, passed away before they really began to work, because it wasn't until the 1960s where they began to actually play the role that she was hoping they would play. And that's because the otters came back. And that's another story entirely. When they came back, what they did was they came back into Monterey Bay and they went right for the marine gardens that Julia had set up. Why? Because they were full of abalone. They were full of species that the otters loved to eat. So they moved in, ate the abalone, ate the sea urchins that were there. The kelp forest bloomed and came back to life. And so decades after Julia's death, the areas she put together and set aside, which were still set aside and protected, became the nexus, the pivot point for the rebirth of the kelp forest and the kelp community in Monterey Bay. Well, that's when Izzy Abbott steps in. Isabella Abbott was a native Hawaiian and with Chinese ancestry as well. She was the first native Hawaiian to get a PhD. She worked on seaweeds, got her PhD at Berkeley, moved to the Hopkins Marine Station in 1961 with Don Abbott, who was her husband and an assistant professor there, and she set out studying the seaweeds that lived in the kelp forest. I mean, this kelp forest had just begun to grow back, and she was one of the premier seaweed biologists of the West Coast and the entire world. Celia Smith, who's a eminent professor of botany and the University of Hawaii now, said that without doubt Izzy was the preeminent marine botanist in the world at that time. She was a lecturer in biology in 1961, began publishing papers. She published a bunch of papers and more papers and more papers and more papers and more papers until 1973, when she became so well known in international circles as the preeminent marine botanist of her time that the biology department of Stanford University promoted her from lecturer to full professor in a single day. She was the first female full professor in the biology department of Stanford University, and it was an honor that everyone realizes was not only well-deserved at the time, but a decade late. She took that and continued to work in around the kelp forests of Central California for another decade or two. She published many books. She essentially was the go-to person for understanding the biology of the seaweeds around Monterey Bay and up and down the coast. She also specialized in what was called ethnobotany, which was the use of seaweeds in everyday life for medicines or food or whatever, particularly in Hawaii, where the native Pacific Islanders had a long tradition in using seaweeds for all kinds of things, but also in California. She was a taxonomist, and so she recognized species and named a lot of species and created a strange biogeographic species pattern. This is just a sort of interesting codicil of Izzy's effect on what we think of when we think about the algae of Central California. This graph here is the number of species that live just along a very short section of coast. They're called 1-degree endemics. And what you can see is that this represents the naming of new species by Izzy right around Monterey Bay, here where she worked for all these decades. Because she worked here, she understood those algae, she looked at them, she realized that there were all these new species here that no one had ever described. She described them right from here. And then there's another pulse down here, near LA, and that's because, in Santa Barbara, that's where a lot of her students went to work. So Izzy's impact on just the names of the species results in these strange graphs that show the footprint of her efforts. She retired to the University of Hawaii half-time. She went to Honolulu for half the time in the early 1980s. She basically then published a 9-volume series on the economics of seaweeds and what their uses were. She published a whole series of work on the traditional Hawaiian uses of plants, and then really focused on ethnobotany while she was in Hawaii. One of the things, for example, that is a very big business around the world is the carrageenan, the gelatin that's extracted from brown algae, kelps and the like, and some red algae. And Izzy wrote in the journal Hydrobiologia in 1996, the first extraction of the seaweed gelatin, that is now this big industry, was discovered by a housewife in search of a pudding. And she just was delightful in trying to figure out the connections between people and seaweeds and how they live their lives. So this story has us, thinking about Francis Clark talking about the changes in the sardine population and prediction that isn't going to last too long. Julia fighting the pollution that was caused by the sardines and setting aside areas so that when if Francis was right, the sardine population and the canneries would go away and those areas would work. And then Izzy was studying the result of the growth of the kelp forest, the bloom of all this life that was there. And then Cannery Row had, of course, collapsed, took the economy of the sardine industry with it. This is a picture of the derelict Hovden Cannery right next to the Hopkins Marine Station. And then in came Julie Packard, her sister Nancy Burnett, and their friends who had a very different view of what to do with this situation, because their view was not the same business model as take everything you can, sell it, and repeat. Their view was that the environment of the bay was one of the best economic opportunities around. And if they could only show people how wonderful the bay was, like they felt it was, that it would really turn around people's view of what the ocean was like. Remember the oil spill in 1969? It sort of scared them and said, well, we need to help people understand why we care so much about it, because it is so amazing. And all we'd really have to do is show it to them. And many and many, many of them would get the same buzz from that. So this is Julie Packard with a model of the Monterey Bay Aquarium here with the Hovden Cannery in the background. This is from the mid to late 1970s when they first began thinking about creating the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Of course, it opened in 1984. This is a picture of opening day by Pat Hathaway. And it immediately began a huge tourist draw, bringing Cannery Row back to life. But the motto of the aquarium was something that all of these people, from Francis to Julia to Izzy, Julie Packard, Nancy, would just buy into. It's inspiring conservation and love of the oceans. That has changed the business model, where we can now see that having a healthy economy and a healthy ecosystem are not at odds. In fact, they work really well together, and particularly when you want to have it all. You want to have a wonderful place to live. You want to have a tourist industry that attracts people. You want to be able to use the ocean and extract from it usefully and sustainably what you want. And you want no one part of that complicated industry to ever be able to ruin the bay for their own gains again. It creates a balancing act among different economic players in the ocean. Well, that all took particular traits that all of these women had. They were passionate about it. They were stubborn. They worked really hard. And they had patience, because sometimes it takes years, decades for a vision to be realized. They're still working really hard at it, and they're still creating amazing amounts of change. They are, in fact, doing all this to try to bring the oceans back to life. They were just pivotal in helping Monterey Bay come back to life, along with many other people that worked along those decades with them. And they've created a legacy for Monterey Bay that says individuals can really make a difference. But it takes individuals bringing the community together to make the biggest difference. And it takes that passion, that stubbornness, that hard work and patience in order to do that. And that's sort of the lesson to me of all this, that individuals can make a big difference. It takes very special ones to really galvanize it, and it takes the unifying principles of saying, let's bring the ocean together for all of us to make it all work.